But what I'd like to do, as a matter of background noise for you, is to talk about Genesis chapter 7. We're going to go to the story of Noah, and I think there's going to be a couple of cool things we're going to get a chance to talk about tonight. We finished Genesis chapter 6 the last time that we were together. Tonight, more likely than not, we'll get through Genesis chapter 7. A lot of it's kind of the core of the story. A couple of sections of it are a little repeated, so maybe it's not quite as detailed as some of the other sections of the story, but there's still some really cool things in Genesis chapter 7, and I want to use this chapter to launch us into a couple of other conversations as well that will, of course, lead us through the rest of the Noah story. But in chapter 7, we come now to the first steps of the actual flood story itself, not just the prep and the lead up. Why is God judging humanity and the earth? He picks out Noah. We talked about that conversation, how God talks to Noah and prepares Noah. But now here in chapter 7, this is what we think of when we think of Noah in the flood. God is telling Noah, I'm going to bring the animals to you. He says, how many animals I'm going to bring to you? We're going to stick them all inside of the ark, and I'm going to close the door, and the flood is going to start. So this is where we are now in Genesis chapter 7. So we remember as we do this, the story itself is significant. I'm more and more convinced the older I get, the stories like this just are exactly what they say they are. And this really happened, and it really happened the way God told us it happened. I don't think there's anything mythological about the Noah story. So I think we have an accurate representation of what actually happened, which if we take that seriously, just walking through this passage should kind of blow our minds just a little bit as we think through some of these details. So the story itself is significant, but God has also built into this story a lot of foreshadowing and a lot of biblical and theological significance. We talked about this the last time we were together, that the story of Noah and the ark is actually doing a lot of theological work for us as well. And so I think there are really fruitful ways of talking about the story about God's salvation and God's judgment and God's preparation and the remnant of God's people. And the new heavens and the new earth is a really interesting sub-theme inside of this story. And we're going to see it in pretty dramatic fashion here in chapter 7. This is the ark is God's vehicle of salvation, the salvation of his people through the judgment of sin. Noah, again, is called righteous. He is obedient. We talked about that language in chapter 6, that God has chosen him. And it also turns out that Noah is a righteous man. So we talked about how that dynamic worked. And then chapter 6 was very explicit with us that Noah he did everything God told him to do. Chapter 7 is going to tell us the same thing. So it feels a little repetitive, but it's significant to the story that God called him, Noah is righteous, and Noah did everything God wanted him to do, right? And then the flood itself in chapter 7, I think, literally changes the ecology of the earth. The geography of the earth, the ecology of the earth, the water cycle on the earth. I think there are some really big things actually taking place here in chapter 7 and 8. So let's start reading Genesis chapter 7, verse 1. And if we have time for it, I've got this great video for you guys at the end with this old British curator from the British Museum of Natural History. He's got his, fuzzy beard all the way down to here and hair sticking out everywhere. He's a kick to listen to. I think you're going to enjoy this. Chapter 7, verse 1. Then the Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and his mate, and 7 pairs of the birds of the heavens also, male and female, to keep their offspring alive on the face of all the earth. For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth, 40 days and 40 nights. And every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground." And Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters came upon the earth. And Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives went with him into the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Of clean animals and of animals that are not clean, and of birds and of everything that creeps on the ground, 2 and 2, male and female, went into the ark with Noah, as God had commanded Noah. After 7 days, the waters of the flood came upon the earth. So the Lord speaks to Noah again. The ESV says, go into the ark. That first word, go, is interesting because a lot of other English translations say, come into the ark. The word itself can go either direction, but the intention of the word is an invitation. So what the word that probably grabs that first phrase best is God says, I want you to come into the ark. So he's inviting Noah into the ark of salvation for him and his family and the animals and so on and so forth. So it's already just kind of this beautiful little moment as God is talking to Noah. Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. This has already been established in chapter 6 in very dramatic fashion. We read the story of the Nephilim, and then God says he kind of got tired of paying attention to humanity because all of their thoughts and the intentions of their heart were always inclined toward evil. And so he said, this is it. I'm going to limit the number of years they can live, and we're going to go ahead and judge all of the earth. But Noah was found righteous before the Lord. So here we are again, sort of resetting the story. It's another sort of chapter break almost inside of the story, where we're getting this notion again that Noah is seen as righteous. Now, the rest of the Old Testament kind of sees it this way. It's interesting how some of these Old Testament characters show up later in the Bible. We read about Abraham and Moses, and they show up a lot in the New Testament and throughout the rest of Scripture. But there's some of these other characters, like Joseph. Doesn't show up very often, but he shows up in a couple of interesting places. And Noah as well. Only shows up a handful more times in the rest of Scripture, but when he does, it's really significant and interesting. In the book of Ezekiel, as Ezekiel's talking about God's judgment upon his people, in Ezekiel chapter 14, there's 2 verses there in Ezekiel 14, where Ezekiel says, if even righteous Noah and Daniel, and kind of goes on this short list, were among you, I still would have judged you. So even if we've got these righteous individuals. So Ezekiel, we get this far into the history of God's people, and the image of Noah and the flood is a man of righteousness chosen by God. So Noah's going to make a mistake later on, but that's not what colors him through the rest of Scripture. Then Noah shows up again in 1st and 2nd Peter, but we'll get to those passages of Scripture a little bit later on. But yeah, take with you 7 pairs of clean animals. Now, oftentimes when we kind of come back to this story, we get caught on this. We go, no, wait a second. I remember in flannel graph school, just the pairs of, just a line of 2 animals. There were the giraffes and the elephants and the monkeys, right? And some turtles down there in the back. They were making their way in. The text tells us something really interesting happens. God did tell him in chapter 6, a pair of each of the animals are going to go into the ark, and we're going to perpetuate the species from there. Here, we've got 7. So 7 is this special number biblically, but 7 of clean animals. You've got to, you sort of ask the question, well, why 7? It might be symbolic that this is this special number biblically, that these animals are considered clean. It might also be the case, and we see this in other flood stories. It's explicit that when the flood resides, the first thing that the family that's left on earth does is they sacrifice to their God. So it's entirely possible that of the clean animals, at least one of that 7 has been brought for the purpose of sacrifice to God and thanksgiving for what he has done. So that's conjecture, right? But that's an interesting thing. Why 7? Well, maybe we've got that. So we do actually have many animals that are just a pair. There's 2 by 2 by 2 by 2. And you've got a lot of other animals. There's 7 of them show up. Now, what else is interesting about this passage of Scripture is that God says, take 7 of the clean animals. Clean and unclean animals are a Levitical notion. So you and I don't know who's clean until we read a couple more books in the Old Testament, until we get to the book of Leviticus. Then we have these long lists and rules about clean and unclean animals. Noah knows something. Noah understands something. Or is it possible that Noah has retained, in his generation, has retained something that God had actually originally taught humanity? And that after Noah and the flood and the Tower of Babel, languages get confused, humanity gets scattered, the nation of Israel finds themselves in Egypt, they become slaves, that by the time we get to the end of the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus, what God originally taught Adam has been completely lost. Is it possible, and I just think this is interesting, is it possible that the law of God is a reteaching of what God had actually already instilled inside of his people one way or another? And we touched on this just briefly last time as well, but Genesis chapter 5 is a genealogy. And it's a genealogy from Adam to Noah. And if that genealogy is just literally dad and son and dad and son and dad and son, if it just is literally that, you crunch the numbers, Adam's life overlaps with Methuselah's life. Methuselah doesn't die until the same year that the flood begins. So Methuselah's life overlaps Noah's life by 500 years. Noah's 500 years old when he gives birth to his sons are mentioned, and then 600 when the flood starts. So it'd be 600 years old, right? So you're 2 generations away from Adam. What has been passed down, right? So this is interesting. So the text says clean animals. Noah knows what that means. Whatever that looks like, right? He knows what that means. So I find that interesting in how the story of Genesis unfolds. We get to Leviticus, it's the first time we're hearing anything about clean animals, but Noah somehow, and I think it opens an interesting insight into what God was doing in those first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. But the text does tell us that Noah in verse 5 did all that the Lord had commanded him. Again, we already know this, but the text is clear. Several times, the text wants us to hear that Noah was obedient. Everything God told him to do, he actually did. So that by itself, that's significant. In its context, it's really pretty much a radical thing. Chances are, you've never seen rain. You have certainly never seen the floodgates of the earth crack open and shoot up water for 40 days at a pop. You've never seen any of this happen. None of your neighbors have ever built a gigantic wooden boat in their driveway. None of them. So this takes a long time to build, and there's Noah and his sons breaking all of the HOA rules, building the ark in their front yard. So clearly he's sticking out. Clearly the notion that he is obeying everything that God told him to do is significant. There's got to be very real tension in this whole scenario. One small family building the ark, and the rest of the world is chapter 6, the first 4 verses. So this is incredibly radical. So it takes a lot for Noah. And not just righteousness, but it takes courage for him to be obedient, to do this kind of thing in this kind of world. It's important for us to hear this because it's always important for us to reflect and ask the question, who is my audience anyway? Why am I living the way that I am living? Why am I saying what I am saying? Why am I doing what I am doing? Is it because of what's going on around me that somehow I just don't want to stick out too much from that? Can it be said of me in a radically wicked world and context that so-and-so stuck out so much we can say they obeyed everything God told them to do, right? So this has the force of its context for us. And so I hope we can at least think through how significant this is for the text to tell us that Noah was like this. So he gathers his family in the ark, and they sit there for 7 days. And they kind of wait for everything to happen. That's got to be an interesting 7 days. You're eating around the table. One of the sons goes, now, how many days has it? When is this supposed to? What did you say was supposed to happen? And why are we in this boat? And where are we going? Right? So they're in the boat for 7 days, and then the flood begins. Chapter 7, verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all of the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened, and the rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. On that very same day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Noah's wife and the 3 wives of his sons with them entered the ark. They and every beast according to its kind, and all the livestock according to their kinds, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth according to its kind, and every bird according to its kind, every winged creature. They went into the ark with Noah, 2 and 2 of all flesh, in which there was breath of life. And those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. That's just a great little detail. When they are all finally inside the ark, God has brought all the animals. Noah's brought his family. God brings all of the animals. In they march. They're inside, and God himself actually closes the door. That's a cool moment. I think it's a significant moment in some ways. So in the 600th year of Noah's life, if you go to the last verse of chapter 5, the genealogy, again, Noah's 500 years old when it starts talking about him having his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Then the text says that the fountain of the deep burst forth and the heavens were open. So the earth breaks open and the sky begins to fall. So this is as unique and catastrophic as anything anybody has ever actually seen. None of this has ever happened before, and in our memory, these kinds of things have not happened as far as we can tell. The flooding occurs for 40 days and 40 nights. This water shooting out of the ground and the rain falling. That's a long time for a catastrophe. I mean, think about a hurricane and your kind of 48-hour sort of period of time from the ramp up to the worst to the ramp down. And that feels like, as we watch those things happen, it feels like a very long time, right? But you've got this happening for 40 days and 40 nights, and it covers all of the earth. The earth is going to change. Ecology and geology before the flood just had to be vastly different. A lot of biblical scholars believe that through biblical evidence, and they put some other things together as well, and there are other ancient texts that talk about how they believe the flood happened. It's entirely possible they hadn't even seen rain yet. So for the sky to literally fall, that's unique. For the earth to break open and shoot up these flood waters, that's going to be unique. You go further back in time, and flora and fauna, plants and animals are vastly different a very long time ago. One of my favorite examples of this, how many of you have ever heard of the giant North American sloth? Did you know there was such a thing? To over 9 feet in length and 550 pounds. Imagine, your normal sloth, you can kind of hold it like a big baby, right? 9 feet long and 550 feet. And it went extinct, surprisingly, a very long time ago. Things were just different before the flood, and things are vastly different after the flood. This and other things we keep putting together inside of the story dovetails, I believe, really well with the notion at the end of the book of Revelation that when God saves his people, judges all sin, the next thing that he does is he creates a brand new heaven and a new earth. So the story of Noah, without a literal recreation, this is as close as it gets. God literally washes the face of the earth off, all of that evil. The text is going to say everything that had breath in its nostrils is now dead. So he's recreating things. The world that Noah and his sons walk into later on is just going to be different than the world that they were in several days before, right? New heavens and the new earth. God saved his people through judgment. And now they are given something brand new to live in. I think it's significant. Again, this story is carrying a lot of weight for us. And so as the Lord shuts him in, again, theologically, I think it's indicative of the biblical notion that it is God who calls us into salvation. It's not my righteousness that makes me saved, but he calls me into salvation, and he is the one who secures us inside of his own hands, inside of his own love. So he shuts the door, and what a dramatic moment, because when he shuts the door, No one on the inside can get out, and no one on the outside can get in. No one on the inside is going to be lost. Not a single soul inside of that ark is going to be lost. But everybody outside of the ark. So God's standing out there, he closes the door, and you just sort of imagine that dramatic moment. Whatever it is that Noah's watching, this great big hand shuts the door, and it's like, oh boy, it's going to be bad for everybody outside of this ark, right? But it's this beautiful moment, again, of God taking the steps to actually save and protect his people through his judgment of sin. Verse 17 of chapter 7, the flood continued 40 days on the earth. The waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The text clearly wants us to view this as a global flood. All of the guesses about a regional flood are just, they're guesses. They come from a different theological point of view other than one that takes the text seriously. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. And all the flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm the earth, and all mankind, including all the Nephilim. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. This level of judgment and destruction, again, is not really matched or reached elsewhere in Scripture until we get to the great white throne judgment in Revelation chapter 20. So again, we're sort of, our own minds are sort of moving forward in the story, and we're feeling other things happen as we read about God's judgment over all of the earth. But the flood rises, right? The ark did exactly what it was designed to do, just simply floats over the surface of the water. The text goes into a little bit of detail. It covers all of the mountains. Even the highest mountain was covered by 15 cubits. Now, what's interesting about that little detail is if you go back into chapter 6 and you look at the measurements of the ark is 30 cubits high. So that 15 cubits of breathing space over mountain peaks is designed to make sure the boat doesn't scrape itself on any mountain peaks, right? It literally covers the draft of the boat as the ark is in the water. So the text has given us some of these kind of cool little details. All of the flesh that was on the earth died. It's a little hard to imagine, but this is actually the point of the flood. That God is judging sin, and we're starting over with a clean slate in a brand new family. The text sees this as worldwide, and every time Noah is mentioned in Scripture, it's just assumed that what the text tells us is true about the scope of this judgment. We go to, let's go to the next slide there, Meg. Let's see what we've got here. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 20. Because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were brought safely through water. So Peter just simply references it as is. He does the same thing in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 5. If he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, herald of righteousness, with 7 others when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. So Scripture just takes this at face value. The flood holds for 150 days, and in the next chapter, the rains and the floods stop and things begin to subside, and we get some of the other steps of the story as well. So, the story is true. Humanity gets restarted with one family. You read through the next couple of chapters of the book of Genesis, and we get more sort of genealogies. Chapter 10 is called the Table of Nations. So humanity continues to spread like crazy, and we have all these brand new tribes and nations. Then the Tower of Babel occurs, this act of hubris against God, and God scatters humanity. But all of them have come out the other side of the flood. They come from Noah's family, as the story is told. So it should not be surprising to us that if this story is true, that there will be other cultures that talk about a worldwide flood. And if you spend a few minutes looking this up, you're going to find a lot of those stories. And not just in a website run by Christian apologists, but in abstracts written for the Oxford Publishing House, for all kinds of technical academic websites and journals. Will talk about these ancient myths of the flood. And part of what's fascinating about them is how much they just kind of do this. We keep watching these things do this. So the flood myth of the Incans is an interesting story. You can see bits and of course they're all sort of over time, outside of Scripture, the story of the flood gets really contextualized and it becomes a part of those people's worlds and lives. And so we hear the echoes of the Noah story, sort of understanding that the Noah story is the true story. Once there was a period called the Pachamama when the humankind was cruel, barbaric, and murderous. Human beings did whatever they pleased without any fear. This is just literally from their mythology. They were so busy planning wars and stealing that they completely ignored the gods. The only part of the world that remained uncorrupted was the high Andes. In the highlands of Peru, there were two shepherd brothers who were of impeccable character. They were righteous. They became very concerned when their llamas acted strangely, it's just good advice in general anyway. The llamas stopped eating and spent the night gazing sadly up at the stars. When the brothers asked the llamas what was going on, they replied that the stars had told them that a great flood was coming that would destroy all creatures on earth. Human beings live everywhere. Llamas, however, remember the flood and prefer to live in only the highlands. I love that. So after the story goes on to say, and sure enough, they hid themselves in the highest cave of the Andes they could, and the water just kind of licked the cave, killed everybody else, and when it subsided, these shepherds and their families went back down the hill and repopulated the world, but the llamas decided to stay up here. I don't know, I get a kick out of these stories. The flood myth of the Hawaiians, the hero of their story is Nu'u. So it still actually kind of carries the phonetics of Noah, as a matter of fact. Nu'u is a man who built an ark with which he escaped a great flood. He landed his vessel on top of Mauna Kea in the Big Island. Nu'u mistakenly attributed his safety to the moon and made sacrifices to it. Cain, the creator God, descended on earth on a rainbow and explained Nu'u's mistake. Right? So you even have the appearance of a rainbow in the Hawaiian story of the subsiding of the flood and so on and so forth. In ancient Chinese culture, there is also a flood story. This is a description of their flood stories. As usually the case with such floods, the cause was the general wickedness of the human race. The single advocate for the human race, which is now stranded on mountaintops plagued by wild beasts, was the demiurge Gun. So they've even got their own story of, a righteous individual is saved because the rest of the world has gone evil, and then off we go. Now this next one, this is the video. It's about minutes long, but I think it's actually worth watching this. This guy's a kick to watch, and he's going to talk about a little Mesopotamian tablet that's just about this big. That was discovered a while ago. Then there were a couple of sort of additional discoveries with it, and it tells this really interesting story. The Mesopotamian world is the ancient Babylonian world, Iraq, Syria, that kind of region. So let's watch this guy kind of talk about this little tablet and what it means.
My name is Irving Finkel, and I'm a curator in the British Museum in the Middle East Department, and welcome to my corner. What we have here is a clay tablet. As a matter of fact, it is not a real clay tablet, it is a replica, because the real clay tablet has to be on exhibition all the time, and also it's very delicate. We couldn't wave it around in front of the screen and say, look at this, look at that. That would be terribly irresponsible. But we can use this replica for demonstration purposes with impunity. The ancient Mesopotamians Sumerians, Babylonians, all those people, they wrote on clay. That was their natural activity. And clay tablets, which have impressions of writing on, are pretty good. They're pretty stable. You can handle them. You can't play football with them, but they're pretty reliable. But what happens in antiquity is there are wars and buildings collapse and fires and disasters and people die and they go away and other people come and trample on things. And when archaeologists find them, it is not often that an ancient inscription on a piece of clay comes to light in perfect condition. So this tablet, you can easily see that it's not complete. There's stuff missing here, there's stuff missing there, and it also looks like elephants have danced a polka over the surface, because many of the signs are damaged or squashed. But nevertheless, this piece of cuneiform inscription is a remarkable thing. This is the oldest map of the world in the world. It has two sides. This is the front or obverse, and this is the back or the reverse. And the reverse consists of lots of lines of cuneiform in different ruled sections. So it's full of information, even though it's a bit damaged. But the other side is the remarkable thing. Firstly, there's some lines of cuneiform ruled across very firmly at the top. And this is about the early creation of the world and how animals were put in the sea in different parts of the universe. It's a kind of brief summary of creation, which has nothing to do with the map, because it's a clear border between that and this. And it's this which is so exciting, because if you look carefully, you will see that the flat surface of the clay has a double circle drawn in the surface of the clay. Now, the double ring is very important because it has cuneiform writing in it, which says it's the bitter river. And this water was deemed to surround the known world because the area inside the double ring is ancient Mesopotamia itself. Now, this word Mesopotamia is the ancient Greek word for what is modern Iraq. So inside the drawing of this circle, we have very interesting things. There is a great river that runs from north to south, which is the Euphrates River. And the river is straddled by a long oblong, which is obviously the city of Babylon. So this is a very important ring of water, because it meant for the Babylonians they had a sort of idea of the limits of their world, where they lived, in about the 6th century BC, with these important rivers which brought life and food to them, waterways for transport, all the way down to the Persian Gulf. It was kind of depicted in small. And if you look carefully at the picture, you will see that in the surface of the known world there are these rings drawn with little bits of cuneiform inside those. And those tell you the name of the city which it represents, or sometimes the tribe. So you have encapsulated in this circular diagram the whole of the known world in which people lived, flourished, and died. However, there's more to this map than that, because if you look at the outer ring, you will see that going off at different angles are triangles. Sometimes people say they are islands, sometimes people say they are districts, but in point of fact they are almost certainly mountains, because the idea is that if you go across the water, you see these jutting, pointed things above the horizon, which are remote lands far beyond the limits of the known world, which go out in different directions from the perimeter of existence. And they are, for the Babylonians, places full of magic and full of mystery. Now, when you look at the diagram sort of geometrically, it is evident there were originally 8 of them. And we can be sure of this partly by calculation of what makes sense, but also on the other side, the inscription which I showed you before tells you what is on each of those triangles. There was a place where the sun was never seen. There was a tree that had jewels instead of fruit, and there were giant birds that couldn't fly, all those sorts of things. There were traditional stories associated with each of these districts, recorded together with the diagram to show where they were. Well, of course, probably nobody ever went there. We're talking about the imaginative world of cosmology, of theology, of tradition, of inherited ideas. But the thing is this: up until quite recently, we didn't know which description on one side went with which triangle on the front. And this is an irksome matter because we know there's supposed to be 8, but there was nowhere near 8 on there. So we had to work out which place the 3, which we could read clearly, matched up with the descriptions on the back, and it wasn't really possible. And then something happened. One of those missing triangles came to light in the collection. Now, in the 19th century, when tablets were excavated, they were very careful to bring back everything. So a big lump of clay, any small bits lying around it, any small bits not lying around it, anything they could find with writing on was carefully excavated. And sometimes the very small pieces, which we couldn't join to anything, were put in special trays for the long-term future when it might be possible to see what we could do about them. Now, what happened was this. Once upon a time, there was a lady called Edith Horsley. And Edith Horsley loved cuneiform stuff. And she came to classes that I used to teach after work once a week to learn about cuneiform. And she was very enthusiastic about it and very attentive and a good student. And when the class came to an end after several months, she said she wanted to do something more.
For as long as anyone can remember, this has been a map with a central piece missing. But from today, no longer. Nicholas Glass reports on an unexpected moment of archaeological excitement in the British Museum.
The British Museum has boxes of tablet fragments, but it's only in the last 2 months or so, when Edith Horsley was first invited to work at the museum, that they began trying to sort things out.
Well, even as a child, I was intrigued by the signs that are used in cuneiform, but it wasn't until I attended Irving Finkel's lectures that I became an addict.
As a volunteer, Edith comes in just once a week. She was asked to keep an eye out for any piece with a geographical or astronomical image on it.
I saw this quite small piece with this triangle on it and the signs inside, and I thought it was probably a map. So I put it in the little section where I put the pieces that I think are of special interest, because Dr. Finkel can't go through all of these trays, obviously. So I put those aside, and he became quite excited when he saw it.
She put aside a little pile of half a dozen pieces that didn't look like everything else, and I went through them one by one, and she said, look, this one's got some lines on it, and as soon as I saw it, I knew it must belong to this tablet, because, as I say, it's such an unusual thing. It was actually rather funny, because the map wasn't in its normal place, it was downstairs on exhibition, and so I got out an old photograph of it, and the photograph was at a different scale. So when I put the fragment on the photograph, I was sure that it must belong, but I couldn't quite see where it would fit. And it was only the following morning that I took the fragment downstairs to the exhibition where it's on public view. And by looking at the original tablet, I could see straight away that it fitted perfectly in the hole. And it did. And as a matter of fact, when I put it in experimentally in the gallery in front of Edith, we couldn't get it out again afterwards. It was such a snug fit, and it had to go down to conservation to be dealt with properly and glued in position. So, having opened a bottle of bubbly and danced around in the gallery, the time came to think very seriously about what this meant, because the tablet is very famous. It's often reproduced in all sorts of different encyclopedias and books about ancient ideas and histories of maps, of course, and it's quite a famous object. And to make a join to that was an extraordinary thing. Then there was the question of what did it tell us? Against one of the diagonals, there was, in cuneiform, the expression, the Great Wall. I'm going to read you what the scribe tells us about this triangle. To the 5th, which you must travel 7 leagues. That means you have to row across the bitter river for 7 leagues before you can land at the foot of the mountain. The Great Wall, its height is 840 cubits. Its trees up to 120 cubits. By day you can't see in front of yourself. By night, lying on ... it's still broken. Then you must go another 7 leagues in the sand, and you must ... because there's always ... because nothing is perfectly preserved. But the important thing is, we now know which of the triangles goes with the description of this gigantic wall. As a result of Edith's discovery, we've got 3 of these triangles in a row. And that is a great boon, because you can imagine, if you have isolated triangles, trying to match them to the description on the back is very difficult to get anywhere seriously and reliably. But when you've got 3 in a row, all you have to do is to find 3 descriptions in a row, and it stands to reason that you'll be able to somehow match them up. And that is what we did. And the discovery was very clear once you realized that the counting was anti-clockwise and not clockwise. So number 4 says, to the 4th, to which you must travel 7 leagues, because it's like a kind of fairy tale. Everybody knows it's always the same introduction. So each time you have to travel 7 leagues across the water. Then it gets a bit broken. Then it says, you see something which are as thick as a parsiktu vessel. This parsiktu measurement is something to an Assyriologist which makes their ears prick. And the fact is, it's only once otherwise known from cuneiform tablets. And it's rather an interesting cuneiform tablet too, because it is the description of the ark which was built, theoretically, in about 1800 BC by the Babylonian version of Noah. And in this account, the details are given, and the god says, you have to do this, this, and this. And then the Babylonian Noah said, I did this, this, and this. I've done it. And I made these structures as thick as a parsiktu vessel, he says out of his own mouth, in the original story. So this word parsiktu is like a kind of noise. It immediately locks in to this thing on the map. Immediately and incontrovertibly. So what it means, speaking plainly here, if I may speak plainly here, is that if you went up this mountain all the way with your sandwiches and breaking regularly for lungfuls of fresh air, eventually you would see against the night sky or the dark sky of the outer universe, silhouetted the ribs made of wood as thick as a parsiktu vessel of the wreck of the Babylonian ark, which, like the one in the Bible, came to rest on a mountain. And if you come down the mountain and cross over the water back to the homeland, the first place you come to is called Urartu. It's drawn on the map. Now, the interesting thing about that is that in the Bible, Noah, in his ark, landed on a mountain where the name is Ararat, and Ararat is the Hebrew equivalent of the Assyrian Urartu. That's quite a meaty thing, quite an interesting thing to think about, because it shows that the story was the same, and of course that one led to the other, but also that from the Babylonian point of view, this was a matter-of-fact thing, that if you did go on this journey, you would see the remnants of this historic boat which saved all the life of the world for the long-term future, from which we, of course, profit today, still there in the crags against the dark sky. So what does this actually mean to us? Well, let's imagine that we can borrow a time machine and go back to ancient Mesopotamia. I've always thought this was a good idea. We'll have a party. We'll all go together. And when we get there, somebody might say, any idea where the ark is? And I go, well, we have the map. Here it is. And in fact, it's there. That's where it is. And what we have to do is get in our rowing boat, off we go, and we will see it for ourselves. So although this is a map which would not encourage you perhaps to motor across Iraq today in a Land Rover, when it comes to operating beyond the limits of the known world, into the world of imagination, it's indispensable. So for the first time we can pronounce with authority that if we were an ancient Babylonian, we would know where to go to see the remains of that wonderful boat. But then there's the actual question of who wove it together. Well, it's often the case with cuneiform tablets that at the bottom of the reverse, there's a bit that tells you the name of the scribe, what's called the colophon. And unfortunately, the scribe's name is broken. There's no trace of it left. But his father's name is there, because in Babylonia, they always said Mr. So-and-so, son of Mr. So-and-so. And the dad was called Itsuru. Now, Itsuru is the Babylonian word for bird. Now, this is a rather an interesting thing because we know all about people's names in Mesopotamia. They usually meant something intelligible like servant of such and such a god, or she's beautiful beyond compare. No one is called Bird. There's no other case of a person called Bird. It's not a very good name. So what does that mean? You look at this for the first time in the museum case, which I hope you will now do and peer through and make out the details. You would think, I see. It's a sort of bird's eye view of the world. Well, I think that's what it is. It's a birdie family, and this is a bird's eye view of the known world and what lies beyond it. So that gives it a special kind of warmth of understanding, because its failings, as it were, from a cartographical point of view, are irrelevant. It is not what they're interested in, and it's given us a tremendous insight into many aspects of Mesopotamian thinking. It's also a triumphant demonstration of what happens when you have a very small, totally uninformative and useless fragment of dead, boring writing that no one can understand, and you join it onto something in the collection which is much bigger, and a whole new adventure begins all over again.
Hey you, do you know if...
So is it possible that it's just all true? Right? Isn't that great? All right, well, let's go ahead and pray and close, and next time we'll come back and we will keep moving through the story of Noah. And I'll try to be as enjoyable to listen to as he was.